All right, let's get straight into it. We are starting in Uganda. Their electoral commission is asking for a huge amount of money for the 2026 presidential elections. We are talking 836 billion shillings. That's roughly 230 million US dollars. And that's just the official government cost. When you add what the political parties are spending on their own campaigns, Uganda's elections suddenly become one of the most expensive democratic exercises in all of Africa. Now, let this sink in. All of this is happening while the World Bank says 41% of Ugandans are living below the poverty line. This isn't some one-off spike either. The budget have been climbing for years. In 2011, it was about 299 billion shillings. By 2016, it jumped to about 476 billion shillings. Then in 2021, we saw 765 billion shillings. This new request for 2026 is a 180% increase over 15 years, and that's growing way faster than Uganda's own economy. At the same time, the country's public debt has exploded, going from about $12 billion in 2011 to over 50 billion today, putting a massive strain on the country's future. But the campaign spending, that's a whole other level. In 2021, researchers found that parties and candidates spent about $1 billion US dollars. That's the same amount as Uganda's entire annual budget for the Ministry of Health. President Museveni's personal campaign reportedly cost about $255 million. The opposition parties, they scrapped together just about 145 million combined. To really put this into perspective, you have to look at what happened in Nigeria's 2023 election. Their electoral commission, INEC, got about $683 million. They then went and spent a staggering 242 million of that on just two pieces of technology: the Beavers voter accreditation machines and the IREV result portal. And on election day, February 25th, 2023, those systems spectacularly failed. The Beavers machines broke down at 40% of polling stations, and the IREV portal, it crashed for hours. But here's the part that got people talking. It only blocked the presidential results because the legislative results kept streaming through just fine. And just like in Uganda, the political parties in Nigeria spent even more off the books. Some estimates suggest an extra $850 million. The only party that actually disclosed what it spent was the Labour Party at about $17 million. This whole pattern, soaring cost, expensive tech that fails, and campaign money nobody can track, is playing out all across sub-Saharan Africa. Election spending is rising much faster than our economies can handle. So in this episode of Frontline Africa, we are going to break it all down. How did election costs get this high? Why is all this pricey technology failing to give us credible elections? And what does all this mean for democracy and the real needs for everyday people? Let's get into it. So the big question is, how do election costs get this high? We are talking about numbers that are bigger than what many countries spend on their entire healthcare system. In Uganda, this proposed budget for 2026 isn't coming out of nowhere. It's part of a pattern of costs that have just been climbing and climbing for over a decade. If you look at the official document, spending went from around 300 billion shillings in 2011 to this new proposal of almost 840 billion for 2026. Even when you account for inflation, that's a massive increase in real money. And people are asking questions. You can look at the parliamentary records. Lawmakers are pushing back, questioning these budget hikes, especially when the country's finances are so tight. Let's break it down per voter. The cost has gone from about $8.50 per registered voter back in 2016 to a projected $14 per voter in 2026. Just for comparison, most established democracies spend somewhere between $1 to $5 per voter. And remember, these numbers are just what the Electoral Commission is spending. It doesn't even include the cost of security, which is on a different budget line, or other infrastructure costs. Then you have the international observers, the African Union, the European Union, the Commonwealth. They all need logistical support, which the host country usually pays for. but those numbers are almost never made public. Civil society groups are starting to talk about the opportunity cost here. The Ugandan Debt Network points out that the money for the 2026 election could be paying for some serious infrastructure or social services. Think about healthcare. Uganda's health budget for 2024 is about 2.8 trillion shillings. That means the election, which happens every 5 years, costs about 30% of the annual health budget. It's the same story with education. That election money could build hundreds of new primary schools or train thousands of new teachers. Young Ugandans are all over social media pointing this out. You see this viral post on TikTok and X comparing the election cost to the bad roads or lack of services in their own communities. Even other election bodies in the region have noticed that Uganda's spending is high. But as the government costs have gone up, the money being spent on political parties on campaign has exploded even more dramatically. So the government spending is one thing, but the real money, it's in the campaigns. How did we get to a point where campaign spending makes the official election budget look small? Well, researchers in Uganda have been digging into this, and what they found is startling. The Alliance for Campaign Finance Monitoring tracked about $1 billion in total campaign spending during the 2021 elections. President Museveni's campaign spending alone is massive. It was estimated at around $230 million in 2016 and went up to about $255 million in 2021. And these aren't official numbers from the party. They come from civil society groups because Uganda doesn't have strong laws forcing campaigns to show where their money comes from. And that's just the president's personal campaign. The ruling party, the National Resistance Movement, and its candidates spent hundreds of millions more on top of that. The opposition parties, they are operating on a whole different level. All of them combined probably spent around $145 million in 2021. The resource gap is just enormous. So where is all this money coming from? It's hard to say because the system is so opaque. There are laws that require parties to report their finances, but nobody really enforces them. It seems a lot of it comes from the business community, but we don't know who or how much. It's believed that government officials contribute from their own budget, but again, there is no paper trail. Money also flows in from the diaspora, usually through personal networks, so it's impossible to track. And then there are hidden costs like security. Those details are often paid for out of public budget, not campaign accounts. Civil society is pushing for stronger transparency laws like the ones in Kenya and Rwanda that would force real-time disclosure of big donations. The massive imbalance between the ruling party and the opposition has caught the eyes of international democracy groups, but nobody really knows what to do about it. This story in Uganda reflects what's happening elsewhere, but Nigeria's 2023 election shows how technology can pour even more fuel on the fire. Now, let's shift over to Nigeria, because their story adds a whole new layer to this. This is what happens when you bet big on technology to solve your election problems. For the 2023 elections, Nigeria's electoral body, INEC, got a massive budget. We are talking about 313 billion naira, which was around 683 million US dollars, almost $1 billion. That immediately put Nigeria among the highest spending countries per voter in the world. A huge piece of that budget, about 35% of it, was spent on just two systems. The Bimodal Voter Accreditation System, or BVAS, cost around $180 million. The INEC Result Viewing Portal, IREV, cost another $62 million. That's a total of $242 million on tech alone. The idea was simple. The BVAS machine will use fingerprint and facial recognition to verify voters and stop fraud. The IREV portal would then let everyone see the results from each polling station in real time. It was supposed to be the key to transparency. The government cost per voter hit around $5.36, which is way above the $1 to $3 you see in stable democracies. And when you factor in what the party spent, the total cost was probably closer to $10 per voter. And the parties spent a fortune. The two biggest ones, the APC and the PDP, never released any detailed financial reports, even though the law says they have to. Civil society groups estimate they probably spent over 300 billion naira combined. At first, International observers were really praising Nigeria's tech-heavy approach. The EU and the US gave technological help, and they saw this as a potential game changer for democracy in Africa. INEC did a lot of prep work. They ran training for all 176,000 polling stations and even had backup plans for areas with bad internet. This was Nigeria's biggest push ever to modernize its elections and fix old problems like vote rigging. But the real test will come on election day, and it will raise a tough question. Can expensive technology actually deliver on promise? So, Nigeria spent $250 million on this shiny new election technology. The promise was a clean, transparent election. But on voting day, February 25th, 2023, the whole thing just collapsed. Even INEC's own post-election report admitted it. The voter accreditation machines, the BVAS, had significant malfunctions at about 40% of polling stations. You had voters just stuck for hours because the machines couldn't read their fingerprints or recognize their faces. But the real disaster was the IREF portal, the one for viewing results. All day long, results for National Assembly and other local elections were uploading just fine. But the presidential election results, they wouldn't go through. INEC later blamed HTTP server errors and said the presidential results had a different data structure. That explanation just didn't sit right with a lot of people. Tech experts immediately pointed out that the same machines and the same internet connections were working perfectly for other results. Why would they suddenly fail only for the presidential race? The selective nature of this failure created a huge controversy. Opposition parties, civil society groups, and ordinary citizens were all asking the same question. How can the system work for one election but not for the most important one? People were posting videos of broken machines and screenshots of the portal not working. Nigerian tech professionals were online breaking down INEC's explanation and calling it out. They argued that any modern system should be able to handle different types of results without this kind of crash. The international observers noted the technical challenges, but didn't really offer any explanation for why it was so selective. INEC eventually had to release the results using other methods, but the damage was done. That $442 million worth of technology had failed, and public trust in electronic voting was shattered. It all raised a fundamental question. Is this expensive tech really worth it, especially in places where basic infrastructure isn't even reliable? And this is where it really hit home. That $442 million Nigeria spent on tech that didn't work on election day. What else could that money have done? This is the opportunity cost. Let's break it down. With that money, Nigeria could have built around 48 new primary healthcare centers, according to the Ministry of Health's own estimate. Or instead of failed machines, you could have trained about 24,000 community health workers to serve in rural areas for 3 years. Think about education. That same money could have built over 2,000 new rural schools, complete with classrooms, libraries, and toilets. Or it could have funded training programs for about 12,000 new teachers every year. Nigeria has a massive teacher shortage, especially in the countryside. What about basic infrastructure? That money could have brought electricity to hundreds of rural communities. It could have paid for boreholes and water systems to give over 1 million people access to clean water, something Nigeria doesn't have. There is no such thing as pipe-borne water running in any Nigerian home. This money could easily fix it, at least for a few states. And it's the same story in Uganda. That $230 million for their election could build around 230 district hospitals. It could build nearly 1,000 primary schools. Across the continent, you have civil society groups like ActionAid starting to track these trade-offs. They are putting out reports that put election budgets side by side with underfunded social services. You have doctors and nurses in both countries pointing out the bitter irony of spending millions on election tech that fails, while their own clinics don't even have basic equipment. And young activists are all over social media with graphics and videos, making it impossible to ignore. They are showing everyone exactly what's been sacrificed for these incredibly expensive elections with predetermined outcomes. It forces you to ask a really tough question. about our priorities here in Africa. Look, this isn't just a Uganda or Nigerian problem. What we are seeing is a trend that's spreading across the African continent. It's almost like an arms race for election spending. Take Kenya. Their 2022 election cost around $380 million. That works out to roughly $15 for every single voter. That was a huge jump from previous years and drew a lot of criticism. In Ghana, the 2020 election cost around $120 million, or about $8 per voter. It's less than Uganda or Nigeria, but it was still a major strain on the government budget, especially during tough economic times. The Democratic Republic of Congo's 2023 election hit about $18 per voter, making it one of the most expensive in the entire world. And this is one of the poorest countries in the world. A lot of that was due to security and logistical challenges in a huge country with very little infrastructure. But it doesn't have to be this way. South Africa provides a different model. Their elections cost about $5 per voter. They have a solid, established system that's pretty efficient. And then you have Botswana. They use a simple paper-based system that costs way less. And they have had peaceful, credible elections and transitions of power for decades. It's proof that you don't need expensive tech to have a functioning democracy. The problem is that there's a lot of pressure to spend. Regional bodies like the African Union and ECOWAS have observation missions and certification processes that add millions to that bill. Sometimes, international donors are part of the problem. Western governments often push these costly tech solutions and heavy monitoring as best practices for democracy. And we are seeing a backlash because young activists are using social media to question all of this spending. They are connecting across the continent, sharing information, and demanding cheaper, more effective models of democracy. Consider the example of revolutionary governments like Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger, where leaders such as Captain Ibrahim Traoré abolished costly electoral commissions and directed those funds towards development, offering Africa a compelling alternative to expensive Western-style democracy and a model more akin to China's focus on pragmatic governance. The good news is there are reform movements across Africa working on alternatives that are more about substance and less about expensive spectacle. All right, let's get to the heart of it. Why are we spending hundreds of millions of dollars on elections when, in many cases, we already know who's going to win before anyone even casts a vote? Across the continent, these huge election budgets are often just funding an elaborate show, not a real contest. Take Cameroon, for example, which, by the way, is holding their election this weekend. Voters are heading to the polls this weekend, but ask anyone on the street, and they will tell you it's all a done deal. The longtime incumbent, Paul Biya, his victory is all but guaranteed. Still, billions are being spent on the optics of free and fair process. Then there is Uganda. Every single election since 1986 has declared Museveni the winner. Yet, the spending just keeps climbing, from around 300 billion shillings in 2011 to a proposed 838 billion in 2026. His victory follows a predictable script every single time, funded by the state and his party's massive war chest. We see a similar pattern right here in Nigeria. The ruling party's deep pocket give it huge influence over the electoral body. It reinforces this public feeling that the All Progressive Congress can just outspend everyone or lean on INEC with financial and political pressure. When that's the dynamic, it completely undercuts the credibility of all that expensive tech like Beavers and IREV. The results just end up looking orchestrated. And it's not just them. In Rwanda's elections, things are tightly controlled. The spending might be less, but any real opposition is pushed aside by legal hurdles long before voting day. In Zimbabwe, campaign costs millions, but the outcome consistently goes to the ruling party. It makes people ask, why are we funding a ceremony when we already know the conclusion? Even in places often seen as democratic models like Ghana and Senegal, campaign costs are rising every second. The ruling parties use state resources to overshadow their opponents, leading to predictable wins. In all of these cases, spending a fortune doesn't actually deliver real competition or a change in leadership. And people are getting fed up. You can see the frustration all over social media. I'm seeing hashtags in French and English calling elections expensive movie sets. People are demanding real democracy, not these stage spectacles. You have diaspora community shouting about the money spent on what they call election weddings, when schools back home are falling apart. This whole pattern brings up a critical dilemma. If the outcome of the election is essentially predetermined, why does democracy cost so much here in Africa? This predictable farce of expensive, scripted elections demands a radical rethink of how Africa is spending its political and financial capital. Now, with so much money being wasted on foregone conclusions, what models do you think can deliver both accountability and development Africa desperately needs for its future? So, is there another way? Do we have to keep spending this much on elections? The answer is no, and some countries are already showing us a different path forward. Look at Ghana. Despite some rising costs, their system is still pretty efficient. They've streamlined things and haven't become totally dependent on expensive technology. And again, look at Botswana, because for over 50 years, they have run peaceful elections, mostly on paper ballots. Their model proves that what you really need for a legitimate democracy is institutional integrity and trust, not a billion-dollar server. Across the continent, civil society groups are pushing for real reforms. Organizations like the Alliance for Finance Monitoring are advocating for things like spending caps and strict transparency laws, and it's starting to work. Kenya has brought in new campaign finance rules that require real-time disclosure of big political donations. It's still early, but it's a step towards transparency. Rwanda has legal limits on election spending, which helps prevent wealthy candidates from just buying an election. Other countries are now studying that model. We are also seeing African innovators create their own cheaper tech solutions. Platforms like the Ushahidi show how you can use mobile phones and citizen reporting to watch over an election without a massive government budget. There are networks connecting activists across more than 20 countries, sharing what works and pushing for legal reforms. And some international donors are starting to get the message, shifting their support towards more sustainable, locally led solutions, instead of just throwing expensive tech at the problem. And it's the youth movement that are really driving this conversation, using social media to demand a democracy that prioritizes development, not just political spectacle. The path forward is about finding a balance. Africa can have strong, legitimate democracies without bankrupting itself. It's about making sure our elections are serving our development, not undermining it. And at the end of the day, real democracy comes from strong institutions and engaged citizens, not from expensive gadgets that might just fail you when you need them the most. Now, if you have watched to this point, this is Frontline Africa, where we talk about geopolitics from Africa's own point of view, where we bring you the kind of stories with the kind of details mainstream media does everything to avoid. So, in this matter, it's a very serious matter. It's about democracy. The Western-styled democracy Africa has borrowed, Africa wants to die on. So my question here is, does Africa really need this kind of democracy? Does Africa need this type of elections that have predetermined outcomes with this humongous budget spreading from the Horn of Africa all the way to West Africa, everywhere across Africa? Elections are almost the priorities of people in power. Every 4 or 5 years, they come up with these big budgets and they conduct an election that we already know who the winner is. The question is, why can't Africa rethink this whole process? Why can't Africa think for themselves? Why must we always borrow Western-style democracy? We end up making a mess of the entire process. It becomes like a ritual instead of a real contest. Now go to the comment section and get into the conversation. Suggest if there are better alternatives. Suggest if we could even ditch democracy entirely and borrow a thing or two from China, the country that have lifted almost 1 billion people out of poverty. And the most painful part of this whole thing is that Africa as a continent has the highest number of poor people in the world. So we are a poor continent, and yet we spend more on election than these Western democracies that we are borrowing from. So should Africa continue on this road that leads to nowhere, or should we rethink the whole process? And if you want to see more of my videos, maybe consider to subscribe and turn on those notifications. I am your host, Ezekiel Enejeta, and I will see you in the next one. It's a bye-bye for now.